From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They called me Ben. We are joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Deckens. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this stuff they don't want you to know. Now, we've been starting off and on with a Twitter roll call of sorts that we had talked about, just to keep everybody in touch as close as we can be during these our days of quarantine. Wanted to shout out in particular Snake Plissken, who just heard our episode on the smiley face killer theory. Snake, you said, "Hey, conspiracy stuff, I just listened to your smiley face killers episode. In the last 2 months, male subjects were pulled from the Milwaukee River." And someone else, Lindsay at Backstreet on Twitter, says, "One of the guys, Luke H., was in my graduating class in high school. I remember he went missing. It was surreal seeing his mom on TV related to the smiley face killers." So it's interesting because, as we said in our episode, the vast majority of law enforcement believes there's nothing to the theory, but the two men who have been spearheading the investigation, themselves former law enforcement, are still convinced there's something nefarious afoot. What did you guys think about that when we looked into that episode?
I mean, it's nice to have two people who have decided to continue looking into it, especially for, the individuals, like the families of the victims that are involved, just to have someone that it feels like they're in your corner. But, it did seem like a bit of a stretch when we did the episode. That doesn't mean it's, not real. It just means we don't have enough evidence at this point to connect everything.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it just felt like, the smiley face is such a ubiquitous, very kind of easy thing to spray paint on a wall. The existence of that, connected to multiple cases of drowning, which is also an easy thing to happen near a body of water, seemed like a real kind of shot in the dark to me. And it seems like that is what the evidence bore out, that it did feel like a bit of either a coincidence or just, somebody getting a little overly obsessed and wanting to find an answer where none existed. And that's certainly a thing that happens,
Well said. Well said. And it sounds like we're all on the same page with this one. We have to add to that the enormous difficulty of proving drowning by homicide. But with that being said, of course, we want to hear your arguments for or against it. And we would, like everybody else listening, want nothing more than closure for the families who have lost these children. Today, we're diving into something that fellow longtime listeners will be more than familiar with, at least in principle. I mean, hot gosh, we're in a new golden age of propaganda, it's often said, right? Since before the 2016 election. Or at least it looks like a new age, as long as you don't dive too deeply. While we're saying we're in a new age of propaganda, it's interesting because it makes for a slick headline, but that's not entirely true. So here are the facts.
If you've listened to this show, you know that propaganda is nothing new. Propaganda is something that's been around forever because we've always needed, we, as in us, every human, those in power or those wanting to acquire power, have always needed a way to convince others that their way is the right way. And if for some reason you didn't check out our very first episode of Stuff They Don't Want You to Know in podcast form, you should do that now because it's all about the life and story of Edward Bernays, who is popularly known, lovingly known, as the father of public relations, i.e. propaganda.
Right. Yeah. And you can read his work for yourself. It is surprisingly transparent because Edward Bernays felt like he was doing a good thing. He thought he was making the world a better place. You can find this stuff for free online. I'd like to recommend, for anybody who hasn't read him before, checking out Crystallizing Public Opinion, and of course his breakout banger, the single in his if his work is an album, the book simply titled Propaganda. I would also say he's a very clear and talented writer, and these are easy reads. You know, it's not like slogging your way through Kierkegaard or something like that. And you know, he will be not by no means the only author you find writing about propaganda or writing actual propaganda if you look on the internet these days, because it is chock full of propaganda. As a matter of fact, propaganda has become increasingly weaponized. It's a crown jewel in the world of asymmetrical warfare. And I have this in the notes, but just for anybody who's like heard the term propaganda or wondering what it means, propaganda is information. It's not always untrue, but propaganda is information with an agenda. It's biased, it can be misleading, and it's meant to make you feel, as the reader or the viewer or the audience member, that what you're being told is leading you inevitably to an obvious conclusion, but that conclusion is not always the truth. It's very tricky. And
well, I mean,
yeah,
it exists. You know, we're talking about it existing now in modern days, and the internet being chock full of it. You can slightly put a twist on anything that gets released from a public relations perspective, whether it's the messaging within let's say a company and the way it portrays itself in advertising, or especially a candidate and the way they are portrayed within an election year.
Well, yeah, I mean, the term is spin, right? Spin is literally taking a truth and twisting it. That is what spinning something is. It is a way of changing the way a thing is perceived, or quote unquote, getting ahead of it, which can basically mean controlling the narrative. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's outright lying. In fact, it's probably a bad idea to outright lie in propaganda, because you can call out a lie. You can't call out a cleverly, strategically placed partial truth quite as easily, can you?
Right. I think I mentioned this in an earlier episode, but it always makes me think of that fantastic line from Emily Dickinson, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And you see more and more of that. I want to arm everybody who's been reading a lot of news, especially political news, with an easy tip to find stuff that maybe, if not propaganda, just opinion masquerading as fact. You'll notice this when you see by the verbs you see in headlines. Like, have you ever read something where it says like, politician A slams country B's announcement of blah, 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 or they slam, or they blast, or they, excoriate, whatever. All when they're putting in those action verbs, that is the spin. That is part of the narrative they're trying to make you agree with. And it's weird because typically here in the US, before and after the advent of the internet, when we would hear about propaganda, it would be portrayed as something that other countries do, right? You might, for example, remember hearing a news anchor saying something along the lines of, "Look at all this crazy disinformation coming from Russia. RT," used to be known as the Russian Times or Russia Times, "has a brand new crazy conspiracy theory." And they might reference Russia's state level propaganda on everything from quote unquote globalists to 5G and more. And you might also, if you're a fan of The Daily Show or a fan of excellent work like Last Week Tonight, recall the weird over the top videos that countries like North Korea or Turkmenistan release. Have you guys ever seen those?
Oh, yes. I recall this very vividly, calling out the United States for its use of propaganda. But in a propaganda format. It was fascinating, and it was highly effective, because I remember watching it and myself personally feeling moved in that I believed it to an extent, if that makes sense. I believed that there was a U.S. campaign to wage propaganda against North Korea when I was watching their tape in particular. And the problem is, it was happening. It kind of is happening at all times, but from all sides. As we said, this is the standard fodder for asymmetrical means of warfare.
Right. Why buy a supercarrier when you can get the domestic population to turn against its masters? We often see propaganda presented as a tool in the dictator toolkit. You can use it to gaslight and suppress local populations, and you can also use it to discredit any domestic opposition. But if you think the U.S. is somehow above this practice, if you think the U.S. is somehow immune to this practice, you could not be any more wrong, sadly. What are we talking about? We'll tell you after a word from our sponsor. Here's where it gets crazy. No, hold on. Hold your horses, hold mine, hold the stable, you might be saying. Domestic propaganda? Would the United States of America really be allowed to gaslight its own citizens? No way. There should be a law.
There should be a law, especially because we're talking about the United States government, the entity that we all prop up every time we pay our taxes, the thing that we make happen that works for us, ostensibly, on paper.
Yeah, and like private entities are a different thing. Everybody expects propaganda from private entities. We just call them advertisements. Wendy's released this amazing mixtape a while back. That's definitely propaganda. Burger King wants you to think that McDonald's is garbage. That's propaganda too. But it's different. When, as you said, Matt, there are tax dollars involved. And there was actually a law. It's called the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act. Its street name is the Smith-Mundt, M-U-N-D-T Act. This is the legal authorization for propaganda activities conducted by the Department of State here in the U.S. I say here in the U.S. The Department of State is based in this country, but Smith-Mundt is greenlighting what could be euphemistically called public diplomacy.
I want to walk this back ever so slightly. When you say public, so this is governing public discourse in some way, or is it trying to keep people honest? What's the purpose? I don't quite understand. If it is meant for that, it doesn't seem to be doing a very good job.
Right. So think of things. If you can listen to this. You can listen to this now in the U.S., but for a long time, there were things like VOA, Voice of America. This is state-sponsored U.S. content that's specifically marketed to foreign audiences. Think of the Horn of Africa, think of East or Southeast Asia, and it's meant to kind of push Uncle Sam's narrative to these foreign audiences. And the act itself says or said that this kind of stuff that we're piping out to residents of other countries cannot be piped in here. So that's why you can't turn on 90.1 or whatever your local NPR station is and hear them talking about how dangerous the government actions of Myanmar or Pakistan are.
I see. Okay. So it's essentially giving permission for this kind of quote unquote, we'd never call it propaganda. The propaganda is not even in the thing. That's sort of a dirty word, but it's essentially allowing that legally within the framework of our government to happen when it comes to outside countries. But it's something that we would never do to our own people knowingly or in terms of demonizing other countries.
Yeah, nail on the head. In short, the United States always knew that domestic propaganda could have a deleterious or damaging effect on the population. We moved to protect ourselves from ourselves. And this comes into play after all the propaganda of World War I and things like that, when people are scrambling for their ration cards and so on. The reasoning here was pretty patriotic, in fact. There's one Senator, Edward Zirinsky, who explained it, I think, pretty succinctly when he was working with Senator J. William Fulbright to try to push this act through Congress.
And the purpose would be to distinguish what the U.S. is doing from the way the Soviets were conducting their propaganda. Zirinsky said, quote, from the Soviet Union, where domestic propaganda is a principal government activity, attempting to kind of demonize that. So Zirinsky and Senator J. William Fulbright sold their amendments on this idea of sensible rhetoric, which I've been trying to get at. American taxpayers shouldn't be funding propaganda for American audiences. And that makes sense to me.
But we should be funding propaganda, to all the other countries that are our enemies or our potential rivals. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, we shouldn't be lied to as the American public. And you know what? We also shouldn't be paying people for the privilege of being lied to. That makes sense to me. It sounds like that's something all of us are on board with. And here's the news. It's quiet news, so don't feel bad if you missed it. This rule, this sort of differentiation between us and the quote unquote bad guys all ended in 2013, 7 years ago, almost exactly 7 years. There was a reform that was passed in January of 2013. It went into effect in July of 2013. It had relatively little media coverage, and it changed the rule. So ever since 2013, the U.S. government has been allowed to market propaganda directly to the residents of the United States. And this sounds maybe arguably like a small difference. Like, does it really matter? It does, especially when you consider how much programming that opened the door for. It's huge.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff produced prior to that you would never get inside the United States. Stuff like it's stuff that's made by the Broadcasting Board of Governors. So Voice of America, that we already mentioned, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Middle East Broadcasting, all of those networks, they can only be viewed or listened to in broadcast quality, like the full quality that you're meant to listen to. Let's say, like, if you're in your car listening to the radio or something. If you were in a foreign country, if you were in a different place other than the United States or a territory, those are the only places you could listen to that stuff. But not anymore. And that content is viewed in more than 100 countries in 61 languages. And within that programming, you're going to hear about human rights abuses in Iran, issues in Tibet, like self-immolation of, certain believers there or protesters there, human trafficking all across the Asian continent, and all kinds of on-the-ground reporting in war-torn areas, in places like Egypt, also in places like Iraq. That's where you're going to find all of that kind of stuff.
But, to be fair, I mean, we have to know that there's definitely a reason for this. There's some valid arguments for this. The VOA's charter makes this pretty boldly stated. They emphasize accuracy. Quote, our journalists provide what many people cannot get locally: uncensored news, responsible discussion, and open debate.
Ooh, Ben.
Yeah.
How do you like that language, Ben?
That's what they said. That's their charter. I think it's a good point, though, because because it is what could be described maybe somewhat glibly as a pickle. There's an anonymous source, or several anonymous sources from the U.S. government, who say that Voice of America, warts and all, does serve a good purpose. They call it counter-programming, counter-propagandistic programming for people in incredibly unstable areas that have little media access. So take Somalia, for example. Somalia is a failed state. It's very difficult to live there. And according to at least one source, again, who wished to remain anonymous, they say Somalis have 3 options for news: word of mouth, Al-Shabaab, or Voice of America, Somalia. So their argument is this propaganda has to exist because it is providing, like you said in that mission statement, Noel, it's providing quote unquote uncensored news. Okay, look, clearly, uncensored news and responsible discussion. Responsible discussion sounds like it could also be censorship. That could be like someone's safe word for censorship, honestly. But that also dodges the real question. Okay, yeah, all right, granted, this is important for areas of the world that would not otherwise have any kind of international news or any kind of larger context, but that fails to answer the question about why we would pipe this kind of stuff, which can sometimes be Orwellian, into the ears of people who live in this country. The argument is that if we do that, by doing that since 2013, this programming has been able to reach large expatriate communities. Like to go back to the Somali example, a big part of the Somalian diaspora is composed of people who live in St. Paul, Minnesota. So they're saying, look, this is propaganda, but it's accurate and it lets us reach people, who need to be reached here in the country. So overall, they're saying we're doing a good thing. Do you believe them? We'll see. Proponents who argue in favor of Voice of America and similar propaganda enterprises produced by the U.S. government say that they are transparent. As a matter of fact, a spokesperson for the BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors again, named Lynn Well, would not even call what the organization does propaganda. Instead, she said it's an argument for transparency. She said, look, this is overall a good thing. Quote, now Americans will be able to know more about what they are paying for with their tax dollars. Greater transparency, she says, is a win-win for everyone involved. She doesn't mention this in her statements, but it is important to note, lest we look askance at the U.S. for marketing propaganda to U.S. citizens, we have to remember a ton of other foreign countries are already marketing propaganda here, arguably a little more successfully in some cases.
Yeah, and before you say, hey, yeah, BBC News in the United States, that's obviously propaganda. Hey, come on. We don't know. Maybe it is. But it's certainly something that comes on my radio when I listen to NPR in the morning.
Well, that's the thing, though. It's all about, what your opinion of propaganda is and, what's the rubric, I don't know that there is one exactly because so much of it you can't prove is a lie or is true.
Well, if there's the slant that Ben kind of mentioned at the top of this here, that's where you end up kind of seeing the cracks, seeing where it actually is propaganda of some sort because there are reoccurring themes. Let's take a quick case in point here and jump to Kansas City, Missouri. Missouri? Missouri? Let's call it Missouri. Well, there was a New York Times article that came out in February of this year that's written by Neil McFarquhar, and he is talking about a radio station that is broadcasting there in Kansas City. It's called Radio Sputnik, and according to Neil and the New York Times, it is a propaganda arm of the Russian government. And it started broadcasting on 3 radio stations in that area during the prime drive time. So radio, if you're in your car commuting, you're going to hear this if you are on that channel. And it's a little strange. Let me just read this quote. In the United States, talk radio on this channel, Sputnik, covers the political spectrum from right to left. So again, you're getting what may feel like balanced news, like you're getting just a regular old station. But there is a constant backbeat, according to this article, that is that America is damaged goods, that there's something wrong with America. Things aren't going right. There are problems, major issues, and here are all of the issues with America. And it's interesting just to know that this is happening in the United States with what is believed, like we said, to be Russian propaganda.
We want to emphasize this is legal. You can learn a lot about the story, and you have to remember there's a human element. So this Radio Sputnik exists in the U.S. primarily because of a radio station owner named Pete Chartel. He was laying, 2 years ago, 2018 or so, he had to lay off his entire staff, and he was having a fire sale on ad spots. He hadn't paid himself in months and months. It looked like his operation was going to close, but Radio Sputnik was paying $30,000 a month to broadcast its programming in D.C., and that's what led him to this. He's not like a Russian sleeper agent a la the Americans
that we know of.
That we know of. Right. He's a guy who's trying to keep the lights on. It's an understandable thing. And this is just one specific example. This could be also, it's been called public diplomacy. It could also be called soft diplomacy. You can win hearts and minds without ever putting your hand on a gun or, God forbid, a nuclear weapon. But we wanted to bring to your attention today something else. That's the lay of the land now, right? Whatever law protected you, quote unquote, from domestic propaganda is no longer in effect. It hasn't been for almost 7 years. So please think critically about all the stuff you've run into since 2013. It also turns out that there's much more to this story. The U.S. has been flouting its own laws for even longer. We're going to take a pause for a word from our sponsor that, as far as we know, is not U.S. propaganda, and we'll get back to you after the break. Here's where it gets crazier, actually. Much crazier.
Oh, what?
Yeah, we've got double the crazy here.
Is that a first?
I don't know. It's a double mint of crazy, though, for sure. The U.S. has been conducting this domestic propaganda kind of operation, these sorts of endeavors for decades and decades. Since your grandparents were alive, easily, if it's the easiest way to crack this one open is to start with two words: Operation Mockingbird.
Yeah, Operation Mockingbird was a secret campaign by the U.S. CIA designed to influence the media, our media. It was started by Cord Meyer and Alan W. Dulles, and later run by Frank Wisner after Dulles became the head of the CIA. On paper, it was all about fighting communism, fighting the Reds, the Ruskies, and promoting Western values. Wisner was told to create an organization that concentrated on, quote, propaganda, economic warfare, preventative direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition, and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance groups, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. Hold on. Let's unpack this. So this is like a free reign to kind of collude with other countries in like an effort of covert warfare back against our own country?
Yeah, this is a quote that directly speaks to our earlier episodes on why a lot of foreign countries don't trust nonprofits. This is a war of ideology, and Wisner is tasked with controlling the narrative in the U.S. and later franchising or expanding into a global war. So that's why, like underground resistance groups, that could be anybody from transparent political opponents of a regime to a student body that gets radicalized. Wisner also is pulling journalists from the U.S. Who are accredited and who work at some top-notch publications of note here, and he's getting them to help fight the battle at home. He turns a guy named Philip Graham at the Washington Post, and he has Graham run this project within the journalism industry, and Graham starts recruiting other people. There's a laundry list of names who may be familiar to our fellow listeners who are history buffs into the murky world of spycraft. We're talking about people like James Truitt, Russell Wiggins, Phil Guilin, John Hayes, Alan Barth. And here's something important. Technically, when you read about this in official sources, declassified documents and so on, you'll hear the program rarely ever mentioned in actual documents. We have one mention that we'll cite later, but then you'll also hear it still described as a, quote, alleged operation. But what did it do? So we've got that, like you said, Noel, we've got a lot to unpack in Wisner's sort of mandate, but how did that translate to actual things they did with journalists here?
Well, ultimately, this thing that we're calling Operation Mockingbird, it was an influence campaign, a way to influence all the media, different media, print media, television. It was to incentivize or threaten, so carrot or stick, journalists to really put out the stories that the people running this operation wanted to actually be out there, to be talked about around the water cooler, to be things that would generally be in the zeitgeist. Or, and this is really important, when a big news story would come out, the operatives that were working, led by Philip Graham there, would be able to spin the news and those big stories as they come out. We can put a little something on it before we, send it out into the world that's going to change the way people are going to view this particular story. Or, and this is probably the worst part, to hide news stories from the public, just to keep things that they've found unfavorable out of our ears and eyes.
Yeah, that's a thing, a method called catch and kill, where you basically intercept the story and in some way or another influence it to not ever see the light of day, whether it's through intimidation tactics or bribery or any number of ways.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to the tactic or the phenomenon known as the Overton window, which is sort of influencing the bounds of what can be talked about, what is considered credible or legitimate or valid conversation. Good examples of this would be the suppression of Agent Orange reporting for a while. Another, I don't know if this is a solid example, but a good question to ask is, why isn't there more reporting about the health effects of depleted uranium, which has been used in firearm rounds? There should be more, but for a long time there wasn't. The organizations that the CIA contacted, organizations and individuals, they wanted to present, as you said, Matt, the CIA's view. The CIA also funded student and cultural organizations and used magazines as fronts. Not necessarily specialized trade magazines all the time, more the kind of stuff you would see in a waiting room at your local doctor's or dentist's office. And then as it developed, kind of like you said, Noel, it started to franchise out. They would work to influence foreign media. They would work to influence political campaigns in other countries. And this was all, by the way, this was all just like gravy on the meatloaf that was other illegal CIA operations already happening. Sorry for that painful comparison. I didn't get lunch today, so I'm all my comparisons are like food-based for right now. But we know that Wisner was a huge success. There's an author named Deborah Davis. She wrote a book called Catherine the Great. And when she's talking about Wisner, she says by the early 1950s, Wisner owned respective members of the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communications vehicles. And they were getting big name journalists, like too many to name, but we've got an example of like at least one or two.
We sure do. One of the most important journalists under the control of Operation Mockingbird was Joseph Alsop, who wrote articles for over 300 different newspapers, and he was far from the only player. The Mockingbird project of influence, the sphere of influence that Wisner held, included journalists from the New York Herald Tribune, Time Magazine, Miami News, the Washington Star, Newsweek, the Chattanooga Times. I mean, papers large and small. None were too insignificant. The whole idea was to influence broadly and also narrowly if needed. The list goes on. According to a guy by the name of Alex Constantine, who wrote a book called Mockingbird, The Subversion of the Free Press by the CIA, in the 50s, he says, quote, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were eventually engaged in propaganda efforts. That's not insignificant. Ben, we talk about the idea of illegal CIA operations. It's just, that's always interesting to me to hear that, because, isn't it like, it's just extra legal kind of, right? The idea that it's illegal, it's almost a misnomer kind of, because it's like, it's obviously got the sanction, the blessing from someone that's a very on high, I always wonder about that.
Yeah, it's the congressional military industrial complex, right? That was the original phrase Eisenhower was going to use, but it got edited out of his speech, so he doesn't mention Congress in it. Yeah, there's so many moving parts to an organization the size of the U.S. government that there are inevitably going to be contradictory agendas. And if you are able to pursue what you see as the greater good, and there's only one or two pesky laws stopping you, then wouldn't you put doing the right thing over following some sheaf of documents that's rotting in a dusty hall? And even if those documents are things like the U.S. Constitution, it's very easy for very intelligent people to rationalize all sorts of horrible behavior, and this goes into the subversion of the free press. That's exactly what happened. Matt, I appreciate that you pointed out one of the most dangerous capabilities of Operation Mockingbird was to, again, I'm like legally required to say allegedly, so was to allegedly keep stories out of the news, to, as you said, Noel, catch and to kill. Wisner was able to stop newspapers from reporting the overthrow of the government of Iran, at least for a while, to prevent them from reporting on the coup in Guatemala, which we should also mention Edward Bernays was instrumental in drumming up at least ideological support for. This is where Eisenhower himself kind of shows up. Henry Luce is the owner at the time of a large media empire, and the rules were a little bit different for him because he was a tycoon. He was a mogul. He wasn't just a hardworking, intrepid journalist. He became key in Operation Mockingbird, and because of his personal wealth and power, he was able to push his own agenda. He really wanted a more right-wing presidential administration. And he did this because he thought it was the best way to fight communism. So he was one of those guys who was always at the time saying, well, the Democrats are very, very soft on communism, and this nation is going to fall if we let these Reds get in and launch their fifth column or whatever. So he used his magazines in concert, kind of, with Operation Mockingbird to help get Dwight D. Eisenhower elected president. And then in 1953, the web expands because Eisenhower appointed a family member of Henry Luce's to become ambassador to Italy. This was the first American woman ambassador to a major country. So on the offset, that seems like a very, very good thing. It's more representation in politics, right? But they got there because in a dirty way. They took a dirty path to get there. And then other members, to your point about, or that point about contradicting agendas, other powerful people in the government, other members of other institutions started to become wary of the CIA's power, even envious of it.
Yes. This is where we're going to talk about kind of the fall of this operation, why it wasn't successful, and why it allegedly doesn't continue right now. Haha.
Yeah, it's because our boy J. Edgar Hoover was not happy with how powerful the CIA had grown. He referred to Wisner's network as Wisner's gang of weirdos. And then he actually started looking for dirt on the members of Wisner's gang of weirdos, looking into their past. And it didn't take him long to figure out that some of them had been active, surprise, surprise, in, oh heavens to Betsy, left-wing politics back in the 1930s. Which is, at that time, was essentially tantamount to being a commie, right?
Yeah, and Joseph McCarthy, who we'll dive into in a future episode on the House Un-American Activities Committee, Joseph McCarthy also started trying to target members of the CIA and say that they were security risk or they were compromised. He claimed the CIA was a, quote, sinkhole of communists. And he said, I'm going to root out 100 of them. One of his first targets was Cord Meyer, who at that time was still allegedly working for Operation Mockingbird. But to put it bluntly, McCarthy had no idea who he was messing with. Wisner unleashed Mockingbird on McCarthy. Several members of the media that were also working on this operation, Drew Pearson, Ed Murrow, Walter Lippmann, and more, they went into attack mode. They're part of the reason that McCarthy got such damaging press coverage. Again, we're not here to defend McCarthy. And he clearly became a flim-flam man who was out of his depth. But the way we got there was dirty, and it was orchestrated in part by the CIA. There aren't a lot of good guys here if you delve into the story. And the U.S. government was then attacking its own people and attacking its own, technically its own agenda.
Well, it's weird because it feels like the change in public opinion, when you're thinking about McCarthyism, and I know we haven't outlined that to its full extent in this episode, but as Ben said, we will later. But you may think of the public support that McCarthy had for rooting out communists in the way that he was and the administration was at that time. There was such support for it, or there was perceived support for it in a lot of ways. And then to have that perceived support just completely taken away by these very prominent voices within the media industry, you can really see it happening, I guess. And it's not in a way that I would have imagined if I was just reading it in, a history book, the way it has been recorded over all of these years. It's just, the winds of change came and now McCarthy was out. But no, there was some assistance there, allegedly.
Yep. And this is where we get to a point where we ask ourselves, what happened to Operation Mockingbird? Eventually, all good and evil things must come to an end, right? This operation had so many players, it couldn't be secret forever. It was an open secret in the industry, in the journalism industry, by the late 1960s. It started to lose its cover in the 70s in a big way because of Watergate. So the Watergate scandal exacerbated concern about the power of intelligence agencies. This is early 70s, 1972, 1974. Congress was becoming concerned that the president would be able to use the powers of the intelligence networks for their own nefarious ends. And then this all hits a powder keg moment when the famous reporter Seymour Hersh publishes his 1975 expose about CIA domestic surveillance, which, fellow listeners, you've heard us talk about that before. Long story short, this leads Congress to authorize a series of investigations into the CIA from 1975 to 1976. They examine a ton of different operations. They also find CIA ties with journalists as well as private voluntary organizations. But none of these reports, interestingly enough, specifically refer to Operation Mockingbird. All the famous Church Committee report found was that, quote, the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of propaganda. And this is weird, because the CIA already knew the heat was coming, and they had begun restricting their use of domestic journalists and foreign journalists, at least according to them, like right as this was all hitting the fan.
So in 1973, the former director of the CIA, William Colby, told the Church Committee that he believed, as a general policy, the CIA won't be able to use clandestine operations anymore, won't be able to use staff to perpetrate these kinds of operations on U.S. publications. It's which have a substantial impact, is what he says, quote, or influence on public opinion. So he's essentially shutting this down, right?
And just 3 years after that, George H.W. Bush, who was then the CIA director, member of the Bush political dynasty, he'd later go on to be president. He said the following, quote, "Effective immediately, CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any new U.S. news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network or station." So there we go. Problem solved, right? 1976 on. We are G to G. That is short for good to go. Or are we? We do have to mention, we teased the one specific mention of Operation Mockingbird in official docs. The family jewels, the infamous family jewels mass declassification of CIA documents, says the following in full. Here, it's interesting to see how they characterize Mockingbird.
And this comes from, and you can find this right now if you're hanging out, theblackvault.com. And this is a quote from the 6th page that you'll find there. Project Mockingbird. A telephone intercept activity was conducted between 12th of March, 1963 and 15th of June, 1963. So a very short time there. And targeted 2 Washington-based newsmen who at the time had been publishing news articles based on and frequently quoting classified materials of this agency, the CIA, and others, including top secret and special intelligence. And, it sounds like a very tiny operation, right? There are 2 newsmen who have access to information that they probably shouldn't have, or that, someone is feeding to them, or that, in some way, these guys are getting access to that secret information that they shouldn't have it. So they checked out 2 guys, they wiretapped them, and they figured out what happened, and then it was over, right?
But they stopped, right? I mean, if everything's fine, they're not doing this anymore. They put the brakes on this program, so no worries. Everything's all good, right?
Yeah, that leads us to our conclusion, and we wish it was a little bit different, because the answer really to that excellent question is not so fast. Decades have passed since the mid-'70s, but numerous people, some of your faithful hosts included, believe this program never really stopped. And it's easy to see why a lot of people believe that. This is the era of fake news. After all, maybe we don't even need the CIA to conduct this anymore. Maybe the massive consolidation of media conglomerates alone has led to more effective control over more media than ever before. The thing is, you'll notice that mention from Family Jewels talks about a Project Mockingbird. We're talking about an Operation Mockingbird. That's the closest we could get. And they sound like very different things.
They sound like completely different things. One is feeding information to the press. The other is trying to figure out how the press is getting all this dang information. So maybe Operation Mockingbird was happening, and then Project Mockingbird was to figure out what the heck was happening with the operation. I mean, honestly, because the people involved, Robert Kennedy, Robert McNamara, huge names. These people are involved directly with the tiny snippet we talked about, Project Mockingbird. Joseph Carroll is involved. I mean, it's so insane to imagine if Operation Mockingbird was real, absolutely was real, just full stop, and they were doing all these things. Who knows exactly how many people were involved and would have information about this compartmentalized activity? It's that whole thing where maybe the left hand has no idea what the right hand is doing.
Yeah. And then the big question is, if you had this tremendous network, this infrastructure, and you knew that you were on the verge of discovering technology that would give you even more control, why the hell would you walk away? It's a question that can't really be answered. And if you dig into Operation Mockingbird, you'll see that it's still legally, again, an alleged operation, but there's no solid cutoff date other than the 1970s statements that we mentioned just a few minutes ago. You will not find an official end for this thing because this thing doesn't officially really exist. So this is where we leave it to you. What do you think, folks? Operation Mockingbird, is it a small-time conspiracy to hassle some journalists? Was it a deeper conspiracy to rule the mind of the public? Was it a conspiracy that never actually ended? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, you can reach us in the usual ways on the internet at Facebook, where we have our Facebook group, Here's Where It Gets Crazy. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter. It's some combination of conspiracy stuff show. We also have a telephone number that our good buddy Matt is kind enough to sort of be the gatekeeper of.
That's right. Our number is 1-833-STDWYTK. Leave a message. We'll hear it. Whatever you want to say, whether you want to talk about this episode or one you want to hear in the future or a past episode, or if you want to talk about Noel's awesome hats that he wears on Instagram all the time or that he's wearing right now, Ben's sunglasses that he's wearing while recording an episode of Stuff They Want You to Know, because you got to be BA while you're making this show. I've got a Magic the Gathering background on Zoom right now. Actually, all of us have really nice psychedelic backgrounds right now. Call us and talk to us about that. What should we put in our background when we make these episodes? Too much? Okay, let's move on.
I think it's the perfect amount. You hit the Goldilocks zone with that one, old friend. But wait, you might be saying, I hate social media. I don't get it, or I hate talking on the phone. It's 2020. But I have something important that you or my fellow listeners need to hear. How do I get in touch with you? Well, we have good news for you, my friend. You can reach us directly 24/7 at our good old-fashioned email address, where we are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.